yourself and tell us all the things we want to know about building an Azure Enterprise Scale landing zones.
Yep, thank you, Jesse. First of all, I would like to ask you to switch off your cameras and mute your mics so that we can start the presentation. I see people are still joining, so maybe...
Yeah, I'm admitting them. There's no problem, Erik.
Okay. So, yes, this is my second session in the Behind the Cloud Meetup series. The first session I presented the building an Azure data platform, and to build the data platform you need a solid cloud foundation, right? So this session I will guide you through the process of setting up an Azure Enterprise Scale landing zone, but also we're going to look at the history, how Microsoft came to offering the Enterprise Scale landing zone in the Architecture Framework and the Cloud Adoption Framework. A little bit about myself. I'm Erik. I'm 54 years old. I'm working at Society for 5 years now, first as a senior cloud architect, and as of February 1st, I'm the lead solutions architect in the data and AI community. Yeah, I'm going to present this, and this has more an infra background, but I will also touch a bit on the data platform in Azure, because that's one of my main interests. So yeah, let's start. Let's see if it will change. Yeah. So the goals for this meetup is I want to tell you a bit about the history, so how it all started with Azure, and how we came to the current reference architecture, which is the Cloud Adoption Framework. We're going to look at the architecture and a more detailed overview of the Enterprise Scale landing zones. And I have a small demo prepared on how to use Azure policies in Resource Graph Explorer. So you can query the policies, and especially if you are looking at an enterprise scale landing zone, security and compliance is very important. So it's nice to know that you have a mechanism in Azure to monitor your compliance. This is my only marketing slide I have in this session. So this is a bit what Society can offer on the data platform side. My focus is mostly on Azure and Synapse, but we also have offerings in Snowflake and Matillion, and we have a lot of expertise also in Informatica and Power BI. And these are the main customers where we're working currently to realize this platform. And we have some publications about our offerings. So let's skip to the fun stuff. A little bit of Azure history. And I'm going to look specifically at the network topologies. So if you look at where Azure started about 12 years ago, there was only one specific cloud service, and it was actually called Cloud Service, on which you could host a website, and the front end of the website was hosted on the web roles VM virtual machine, and the processing of the web request was done on the worker VM, and there was a storage in between to save your data. There was quite limited, so to speak. So there was no network in this. So no VNets, no network security groups, and this service still exists. It's called Cloud Service. It's one of the classic services that still remains in Azure, and there's some customers still are using this. Microsoft is going to deprecate this. I don't know the exact date, but it will be deprecated for sure. As of course we now have app services where you can host a website. So wait, what? No network, no route table. So how can you then set up a cloud foundation, right? So so Microsoft added more services like SQL database, but also they added networks, VNets, as they are called. And we at Society thought, well, we needed a building block in regards to our network architecture. So we created this building block, and you see it's a bit of a mesh architecture with different zones and a management services hub with express route to on-premises to get hybrid connectivity. And we had an external zone, an internal zone, and a public edge where we hosted all the gateways. And the left side was for non-production and the right side for production. But if you would, and this was a building block, as we call it in our reference architecture. But if you would scale this, you would build this whole architecture again and again and again to create to reproduce these building blocks. So that was quite costly, because if you use firewall services, for example, in the public edge, and you have licenses, for example, for Barracuda or Checkpoint or Palo Alto, they're pretty expensive. So if you would replicate that, you would also replicate the costs. But the fun stuff is that we could route our traffic in different zones, different VNets. And Microsoft later came with VNet peering, so that we could connect these VNets and could route traffic from one VNet to the other. But it was not transient, the routing. So you could not go directly from the public edge to the external zone to the management services. So there needs to be a routing device in between. Excuse me. So then came the next reference architecture, and Microsoft came up with a new reference architecture called the hub and spoke reference architecture. So we thought at Society, what the heck, we need a new building block. So we created another new building block in our reference architecture called the hub and spoke building block with connectivity to on-prem. But then all the routing services and shared services were located in a centralized hub, so that you don't have to replicate it multiple times to create the same functionality. And in the spokes, all the workloads were located. So every traffic went through the hub, so you could do traffic inspection and all kinds of services, reverse proxies, etc., in a centralized manner. And we had a disaster recovery hub in the payout region. For example, this was West Europe, and we had a disaster recovery hub in North Europe. So this was our new architecture, and we implemented this at a few customers. But yeah, if you look at specifically at the hub, it's meant to host all the shared services, which are generic or common to all the workloads in the spokes. And to give you a few examples, the shared services hub became quite a cloud foundation with a lot of different services. So, for example, you had 80 domain controllers to domain join your VMs in Azure. You have maybe a third-party identity broker like Okta. You had the AD Connect agent to sync your local AD domain controllers with Azure AD. But you also had firewall services, or maybe a third-party API gateway if you don't use the Azure management. API management, file transfer gateway, reverse proxies, maybe a firewall specifically for the internet, firewalls to on-premises. So it became quite messy, and you can add services, and this is just a subset of the service you could put in the hub. So this wasn't really scalable. For example, if one of these services broke, then you had to do a disaster recovery of the full hub, because if the firewall broke, there was no traffic between the workloads and on-premises, for example, over the express route. Or if your egress firewall, so your internet firewall broke down, no workload could access the internet anymore. So this was also not really scalable. So then Microsoft came with another reference architecture, which is part of the Cloud Adoption Framework, and that's called Enterprise Scale Landing Zones. The main goal of this architecture is to separate a number of functions of your cloud foundation. Say connectivity, identity access management, and management functions like monitoring, logging, security, etc. But it also created separate landing zones for workloads, which I will show you later. This is a highly scalable architecture. It's built. The architecture is based on building blocks which are modular, thus also repeatable, so you can create it multiple times, and it's easier to delegate because you separate the specific functions. Say connectivity, it's easier to delegate that to, for example, a centralized network team. Same with identity and access management, because these are complete different functions, and it requires a complete different skill set than, for example, identity and access management opposed to connectivity. You can deploy a complete landing zone using Azure Blueprints. I won't go too deep into that, but Blueprints is a collection of ARM templates, policies, and role-based access control role assignments, which you can assign at a certain level, mostly on management groups, and it will deploy the complete landing zone for you. And you can create the blueprints in draft first and then publish them so the deployments commence. But you can also, of course, deploy the Cloud Adoption Framework from, for example, Azure Pipelines. What you need to do is you have to centralize when required and decentralize when possible. What you will see is that workloads are mostly decentralized. Monitoring, logging, connectivity is mostly centralized. So the core functions of the Cloud Foundation is mostly centralized. So if you look at the Cloud Adoption Framework and an enterprise scale landing zone, this is a landing zone for small deployments. So it's based all in one single subscription, only meant for really small organizations that can manage a subscription with a very small number of teams. But this is not scalable, because then you have the same issues with the shared services hub, that you have a lot of services in a single subscription, and it's difficult to delegate to different teams. So you get issues with authorizations, and there's a lot contained in one subscription. And if you grow and you have a lot of different teams and users, and maybe you run into some subscription limits in Azure, so this was really not scalable. So ultimately, if you look at the deployment for large-scale deployments, or the architecture for large-scale deployments, it looks like this. This is the architecture that is published on the Microsoft website. The link is down below, and it's built out of a couple of different sections. And you see, maybe it's hard to see, but you see letters next to each section. So if you look at this, this is the management group, and basically the core of the enterprise scale landing zones, where you define your organizational structure. So how do you organize your subscriptions? And what you will see is that Microsoft has separated the identity subscription, which you can find here, the management subscription, and the connectivity subscription. And we say at Society that's basically our cloud foundation. And they also separate out the workload in a separate subscription, which they call the landing zone. And in this workload description, you can have all kinds of workloads. In this subscription, you see a couple of workloads, but it can be anything. If you look at, for example, a data platform, it can be Synapse, can be Data Factory, a data lake, Databricks, etc., etc. So it's Azure offers a lot of services. And there's a separate Sandbox subscription for experimental reasons. So if you want to have a less policy restricted subscription, then you can use a Sandbox subscription. And this has no connectivity. So you can't mess with other services in Azure. So it's completely separated from all other services. And of course, one of the main principles is infra as code. So you deploy it with GitHub or DevOps, and you have all the ARM templates for the landing zones in your Git repository. So this is the overall architecture. So let's dissect every single piece of this architecture. If we start with the enterprise enrollment, this is more how tenants are organized within Azure. You have a department, and within a department you have accounts, and in these accounts you can create subscriptions, and subscriptions are administrative unit to organize your resources in Azure. If you look at how this is organized in Azure, you will see management groups at the top. The subscriptions are part of a management group. The resource groups are part of subscriptions, and the resources are always deployed in a resource group, with a few exceptions. Those are the global resources like DNS or Active Directory. But most of the resources, like SQL databases or a web app, go into a resource group. And resource groups are also region bound. So a resource group can be in West Europe or North Europe or East US, or there are a lot of regions within Azure. There's also a nice overview on the documentation site from Microsoft, where you can see all the regions. But that's not the scope for this this session. But it's important to remember this, because it defines ultimately how your deployment will look like. So if you look at the identity and access management part, this is basically how you organize your Azure AD. Do you want to use MFA, which is part of the conditional access functionality of Azure? Do you want to have access reviews on accounts used in Azure? You can create audit reports, approval workflows with PIM, privileged identity management. So, for example, if you have a global administrator with high privileges, you can set up a approval workflow that always another AD user needs to approve the request of getting access as a global administrator. That's privileged identity management. But you can also create custom roles. And most access is done based on security principles in Azure AD. That can be AD security groups, that can be service principles, managed identity. So there are a lot of different security principles in Azure, but you can also create custom roles, airbag roles, to which you can assign a security principle to do specific authorizations. So to assign specific authorizations, but I will come to that later. So if you look at the management groups and how to organize your subscriptions, I would say this is an example from Microsoft, but I would recommend to set this as default. And we saw before that in the Cloud Adoption Framework and Enterprise Scale Landing Zones, this is the de facto standard to have a platform which contains an identity subscription, management subscription, and connectivity subscription. But the other ones, I would say, these are optional. So you can create an organizational-wide management groups with maybe a management group called landing zones or platforms or whatever. You can make a division between platforms or geographical locations or maybe line of business. So it's up to you how to organize that. This is more for if a landing zone is decommissioned, you can put a subscription under this landing zone, and you can, for example, attach a policy to it that no resources can be deployed to this subscription. But if the subscription needs to be restored, then you can move it back to the landing zone, and then you have restored your subscription, because that subscription will then inherit the policies and all the settings you assign to this management group. So yeah, it's easy to restore it. And of course, the Sandbox subscription, which is also optional. If you need it, you can create it. If you don't need it, you can leave it as it is. So if you look at the management subscription, that's used to monitor, to do inventory management. Inventory management is done through automation accounts. So Azure automation accounts consists of a number of functionalities, and inventory management basically checks for VMs, for example, what applications are installed on this VM, or what are the operating systems settings, etc. And it does change tracking, so it keeps a log of changes to all the Azure resources. And you can also do update management, so critical security updates or whatever, you can do that via automation account, and you can schedule that. So it's a complete management suite. But you can also have a centralized log analytics workspace. And from that log analytics workspace, you can create dashboards or custom queries, and you create alerts from that, so that you can set up a proactive monitoring system. But also on this management subscription, you can set your specific roles, role assignments. You can assign policies which are specific to management, to monitoring and logging. You can set up a network watcher for network monitoring, and of course your security monitoring. And of course, you can set up a sort of hybrid architecture where you offload your a subset of your logs in your log analytics workspace to, for example, Dynatrace or whatever on-premise monitoring system you use. And because this is a separate subscription, you can create a specific authorization on the subscription level and delegate the whole subscription to a monitoring team, for example. And that's pretty handy because the monitoring team can manage this subscription, but can't do anything in the connectivity or identity and access management subscription. So that's scalable. What you also need to think about is, do you want to have centralized infrastructure monitoring, or do you want to decentralize that? And with decentralized, I mean, do you want also to have specific monitoring in the landing zones for the workloads? Also some hybrid management. This is in this diagram, you see only log analytics connected to a subset or to on-premises systems. But of course, you can also connect your security center to on-premises systems. For example, with in this diagram, it's still security center, but it's now called Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Another name change. There are quite some name changes lately. But you can also have security incident and event monitoring with Sentinel and connect that, for example, to your on-premises SIEM system. And also, you can offload part of your inventory management to a on-premises CMDB system, so configuration management database, which holds all the configuration of your full landscape of your all your assets, all your IT assets. If you look at the connectivity subscription, this manages all the connectivity, and that can be firewalls, that can be the express route, it can be DNS, so all the VNet peerings to the landing zones. So it's also functioning as a routing hub. The connectivity can be through on-premises to internet, or and between spokes through these VNet peers. I said before, if you have multiple spokes connected to the VNet, to the hub VNet, you can't go from one spoke to another without a routing device which does the connection, because the spokes are not transient. And you can do centralized firewall management. If you use, for example, Azure Firewall, Azure now also has a functionality that you can manage all Azure firewalls completely centralized. But if you don't want to use Azure Firewall, you can use network virtual appliances with third-party firewall applications like Checkpoint or Barracuda or Palo Alto. There are quite some third-party security devices in the Azure Marketplace. And Azure also added Virtual WAN to the connectivity functions or resources, and that's more to create a global virtual wide area network, so that you can connect seamlessly the various locations. So if you have a geographical dispersed Azure environment or Azure setup with different regions, then you can use Virtual WAN to have a consistent connectivity layer for all your Azure locations. And the last part, this can go. The last part is the landing zone, which holds the actual workload. So this part is designed, so a landing zone is designed specifically to host workloads, and that can be anything. So from VMs to like I said, data analytics, but also IoT. So there's a very big variation in which kind of workloads you want to host. And also you need to see what you want to delegate to the subscription manager for the landing zones, because it also needs to have some virtual network, DNS resolving, user-defined routes, and network security groups, which acts as a layer 3 firewall on the network. And that requires quite some knowledge about the networking part in Azure. So do you really want to delegate that to a, for example, line of business team? I don't know. I don't think that's the right way. I think that still needs to be managed by a central network team. But yeah, it's up to you how you want to design that. Also, because it's a single subscription, cost management will be much easier, because if you have assigned this one landing zone to a specific team or department within your organization, it's pretty easy to assign or allocate the cost to that specific department, because all the cost made in this subscription can be allocated to that department. And you can create specific role-based access control assignments and policies, which can be workload specific. For example, a data platform may have different role-based access control assignments and different policies than, for example, a complete IaaS deployment. So that's that's also pretty scalable and customizable as much as you want. Not that it would be recommended to create a lot of customization, but it's possible. And of course, the Sandbox subscription, but I think that that speaks for its own. There's no connectivity. Use it for experimentation only. And what you often see is that dev test subscriptions are used because there's some discount. The costs are lower with dev test subscriptions than enterprise subscriptions. And my advice would be that you put budgets and cost alerts on this subscription. Why? Because the users of this subscription often have full autonomy to deploy whatever they want. And if you, for example, deploy a Synapse dedicated SQL pool with a lot of cores, then the costs are can be pretty high.
So Erik,
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yep.
Wait a moment. The question from our colleague Mark Hendricks. Do you create a landing zone for each team, department, or environment, dev test, acceptance, production, or does this depend on the organization?
Good question. I would say it does depend on the organization. What I miss a bit in the documentation from Microsoft is that they don't really.
Sorry, Erik. Please mute your.
Muted. Okay, thank you.
Go on.
So what you see in the documentation that you see, you don't see a lot of difference between dev, test, acceptance, and production. They say you create a landing zone for example, a SAP deployment, SAP platform, but it doesn't say you need to deploy a dev, test, acceptance, and production, which is, of course, still the way a lot of organizations are deploying their resources. Also, I mentioned the management group structure. You can create your own management group structure. You don't have to adhere to the enterprise scale landing zone architecture, which is created by Microsoft, but you can create your own setup, which should be maybe a better fit for your organization. Okay, so these are all the building blocks in the enterprise skill landing zone architecture. When you look at access control, which is a very important part, Azure has a lot of built-in access roles, but be very careful about that because, for example, if you use a blob storage data contributor role and you assign that to a storage account, the user that has access to the full storage account. So if you, for example, if you set up a data lake and you want to have separate teams with separate containers, and they need to have separate access, so there's some sort of Chinese wall. One team may not is not allowed to access another team's data. Then that whole security architecture is down the drain because you opened your full storage account using that built-in access role. So be very careful about that. There's a new type of access control in preview currently. That's attribute-based access control, and that can be very handy because then you can say, okay, based on an attribute a user or a group or a resource in Azure has, we give certain access. For example, someone has access to the SAP platform. We tag all the resources in the SAP subscription with SAP. We create an attribute-based access control based on the tag SAP and assign it to a specific AD group. So then every user that needs access to the SAP platform only has to be in that Active Directory group, and they have access to that the platform. So, and that can be used for all kinds of reasons or purposes. Another one is custom airbag roles. Sometimes the built-in access roles are not sufficient, and then you need to create your own access control roles, and that's possible in Azure. And so that can be very convenient if you can't find the proper access with the built-in access roles. Also, and that's a very actual situation with one of my customers, you have a max role assignments per subscription of 2,000 role assignments. If you hit this limit, there's a hard limit, then it's over. You can't assign any roles anymore. So yeah, that's not a good situation. But Microsoft, as of November, I think, or December, is increasing that to 4,000. So that gives it more slack, but still, if you reach the limit, maybe you will also reach 4,000, but 4,000 is pretty high. So that's something to keep in mind. One also very important part of security and compliance is Azure Policy. Azure Policy is used to log or force or grant or prohibit, deny certain actions or configuration of Azure resources. For example, you can create a policy which says you can only deploy resources in Western Europe and not in the US, for example, because there can be difference in cost or for performance reasons, because if you have a resource in Europe that needs to access a resource in the US, for performance reasons, that's not a very good idea if all the data is in Western Europe, for example. With these policies, you can deny a resource change. You can log the change to the resource. You can even alter the resource before the change or alter the resource after the change. So you can enforce certain configuration on the Azure resources, or you can deploy related compliant resources. What you see is that mostly you see deny, log, and alter. And Denying is for example, what we are looking now at our current customer is we are looking at denying deletion of our enterprise data lake. We deploy enterprise data lake, there's a lot of data in it, and you don't want to have an Azure pipeline accidentally delete that data lake. Luckily, Azure offers a data lake restore or storage account restore service. So you can now get an accidentally deleted data lake. You can restore that pretty easily. But still, maybe you have some resource that you really want to deny, have a deny policy on that. Also with the logging the change to the resource, that's also handy for compliance reasons. If you want to have a compliance reporting dashboard or something like that, you can log the change to the resource to a, for example, log analytics workspace. There are different effects that a policy can have. You can have an append effect. Then the defined set of fields in the policy will be added to the request. You can have an audit only, then it generates a warning event, but nothing happens. You can say audit if not exists. So if a certain resource does not exist, you can create a warning event in the activity log. You can have a denied policy, etc. The most used current are probably the audit if not exist, deny, and deploy if not exist. Deploy if not exist is specifically used for self-healing. So if a resource does not comply to the policy, then the policy can make sure that it is compliant by changing the resource. And it will then deploy the related resource if it doesn't already exist. So my advice would be start with audit or audit if not exist, and then move towards changes. So if this is stable and you don't see a lot of policy violations, then you can move towards the changes. You have to choose your assignment scopes for the policy very carefully. And what you mostly see is that policies are assigned on management group level. And policies, so separate policies for specific resources can be grouped into initiatives. So you can create a set of policies which maybe complies to your compliance framework or your security baselines. So it's then easy to monitor them and report on these initiatives. Policies can be exempted. So you can exempt a policy and then it doesn't apply to the scope you assign the policy to. And it can be queried via custom query language in resource graph. And for that, I have a little demo prepared, which I will show you later. But first, if you look at this management group and the policy assignment scope, these are basically the different levels on which you apply the policies. You can have, for example, organizational-wide policies, which applies to all resources you deploy in Azure. That's on tenant level, or on department, or maybe on a specific workload. You can also have, for example, specific policies for sandboxes, or maybe no policies at all, but that's up to you. And same with the separate subscriptions like identity and access management, or the monitoring and logging policies, or maybe you have specific connectivity policies. So that you can do a lot with policies. So for that, I would like to show you a little demo I prepared. So if you look at Azure, this is my Azure portal and this is my dashboard. This is a bit of a custom dashboard. It's my private dashboard. But if you go to the Resource Graph Explorer,
we still see your demo.
Yeah, there's no demo there.
Okay.
Okay. So again, this is my my dashboard. But if you in the search bar type resource Graph Explorer, you get a resource Graph Explorer, which is based on Data Explorer. And basically, everything that's deployed in Azure, you can query in Resource Graph Explorer. And also all the policy resources. So if you expand the table policy resources and you look at policy states, and you click on that and you run the query, you get a list of all the policy states, but it's quite a messy list. And if you look at, for example, the properties, you see a lot of properties in this list, but yeah, it's hard to see where's my compliance state. It is in there somewhere, but it's hard to see. So what you then do is look at the see details, and here you see all the properties. And if you scroll, and maybe it's not in this one. Oh, yeah. So here you see the compliance state of this policy is compliant, but you can also see the policy assignment name, the definition, etc. So a lot of parameters, and also the action. So this one is audit if not exists. So it won't change anything, it only audits. But you can do a lot of stuff with it. I prepared, for example, a query which shows the policy resources states, so the compliance state per resource group. So if you run that query, you see all my resource groups and the number of non-compliant resources. So yeah.
I get another question from Adam. Aren't compliance results written to the activity log? Is the question of Adam.
That depends on how you set up your monitoring within Azure. If you use, for example, SIEM, SIEM also uses Data Explorer as underlying platform. Then it's written to so Sentinel. Then it's written to a log analytics workspace. But this is the Azure Resource Graph Explorer. So this is what Azure creates under the hood. You don't have to do anything for this. It's a service provided by Microsoft.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much, Erik.
So you can do a lot of nice stuff with that. And for example, you can create a chart out of it. I select bar chart. You can pin it to a dashboard. I have a private dashboard, but I can also have a security and compliance dashboard. And if I go to my dashboard and I use my security and compliance dashboard, I have my full compliance of all my policies based on resource group. So you can do that on resource type, you can do that on location, subscription level, management group, whatever you like. So this is very flexible. So this is my demo for Azure policies. The second demo I want to show you is Microsoft Defender for Cloud. And Microsoft Defender for Cloud also has a regulatory and compliance framework. Microsoft Defender for Cloud, formerly known as Security Center. So if you go to Microsoft Defender for Cloud, you see a regulatory compliance function, and it shows all your compliance frameworks. And this is also built on policies. So if you look at, for example, identity and access management, this is then the Microsoft Sys framework. It says, for example, multi-factor authentication should be enabled on accounts with read permissions on subscriptions. And you see the field resources. This is a complete framework, and you have ISO frameworks, you have Sys, so there are all kinds of frameworks, but you can also add your own framework. So you can create, and that's called initiatives. You can combine a set of policies into initiatives and show it in this dashboard. But the beauty of this, and that's in the beginning, this was not possible. You can also open the query and alter the query to your own wishes, because it uses, again, also Azure Resource Graph Explorer. So you can, for example, join your queries with other tables in the Azure Resource Graph Explorer. So, for example, if you have a Kubernetes cluster, you can create your query on Kubernetes resources and all the compliance and policy compliance on this, the AKS clusters. This is, well, I would almost say unlimited in possibilities. So this is also very, very useful. And if you run that query, you should see the same results as what you see in Azure Defender for Cloud in the regulatory and compliance. So for compliance, and you can fully automate your complete compliance reporting if you like. You can also, for example, run this with PowerShell, offload it to a SQL database or a data lake, and then create Power BI reports out of it. So it's very, very powerful. So this was my demo. Let's go back to the presentation. So what Microsoft also provides is a new, I say new functionality, but it's in public preview quite some time now, and that's called Azure Blueprints. And Azure Blueprints is basically a declarative way to orchestrate various deployments, for example, landing zones. And in those blueprints, you can put role assignments, policy assignments, but also ARM templates and resource groups. And it can create a complete landing zone based on that blueprint. It's a reusable design building block, like you saw in the architecture. You can deploy that, and from the Microsoft documentation side, there are links to a GitHub repository where all these building blocks are available. So you can clone that repository to your own repository, and you can play with that or create your own landing zones. You can assign blueprints at management group level or subscription level, so not at resource group level or at resource level, so management group or subscription level only. And there are a number of ways to create that. You can use the Azure portal, not preferred, of course, because you want to do it infra as code, but you can also use PowerShell and use Azure Pipeline with the PowerShell script to deploy a blueprint. But you can also use the Azure client or ARM templates. But yeah, the most preferable way would be PowerShell with Azure pipelines. Let me look at the time. I have a couple of slides left. So if you look at a scenario that you could apply to an enterprise data landing zone, then there's a new paradigm that stems from ThoughtWorks, and that's called data mesh. In a previous meetup session of one of my colleagues, the data mesh was explored and explained by a Microsoft solution architect, and it's Microsoft puts a very has a very high confidence in data mesh. So they have also a breadth architecture they called scalable analytics. Data mesh is highly scalable. It's built on the Cloud Adoption Framework enterprise landing zones, enterprise scale landing zones. It's meant to democratization of data, difficult word in English, So that means that you give the business more power to manage their landing zones and their data, which the business owns the data, so they can have full control over their own data. It requires data management and standardization. Otherwise, if the mesh nodes, and such a data landing zone is then a mesh node, if there's all kinds of customizations in different nodes, it's very hard to manage. Also, these are reusable data solution building blocks, so you can copy or recreate these landing zones multiple times. And there's an architect at Microsoft, Pieter Strenghold, which I work very closely together with, and he wrote a book, but he also has a very nice blog series implementing data mesh on Azure. And I really recommend, if you are into this subject, to read his blogs, because that's very interesting. And from these blogs, I took two architectures. One is the governed, and in the governed data mesh, you have a data management hub, and all landing zones are only creating data products and data transports through these data management hubs. So all the integrations are done in the management hub, but also you have a component like, or an Azure resource like Purview. And Purview is the data catalog. So and that's based on discovery. So you can discover all data assets in the landing zones in Purview, so you can manage that centrally. And that's for compliance. Data compliance is very important. But all the infra, so the cloud foundation, is done by the Cloud Adoption Framework landing zone. So the identity and access management, connectivity management, so monitoring and logging, that's all in the Cloud Adoption Framework, so in the enterprise scale landing zones. So the management hub is on top of the enterprise scale landing zones. But you also have a federated option, and that means full power to the landing zones. So there is no data management hub. All the data management is done within the landing zones by the owner of the landing zone subscriptions themselves, but it will be built on the enterprise scale landing zones, which is part of the Cloud Adoption Framework. So this is not really recommended in enterprise because you want to have some control, a lot of control on the data. So data insights, cataloging data, storing metadata about all the data in the landing zones. So it's this is more recommended for compliance-driven organizations, like, for example, banks or insurance companies or utility companies. So yeah, this is one of the examples you can build on a enterprise scale landing zone.
So Erik, how many minutes do you need?
Just a couple.
Okay.
I'm about to show my last slide.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, some takeaways and lessons learned. Don't try to find your own reference architecture, and my recommendation is really stick to the Azure reference architectures. You can have a slight deviation from that, but if you deviate a lot of that, you will in the end be sorry, because it's hard to get support and that kind of stuff to because you have your own custom-made landing zones. That's not the best way forward. One principle which is very important: everything is code. So even the policies you saw, the policy definitions and assignments, you do that in as code, so with ARM templates, and make sure that your pipelines are secure by design. So make sure that you have proper authorizations on these pipelines set also on the resources in Azure, with robust access control and service principles and that kind of security. So it's very important that you plan your authorization model carefully, because it can be very complex to have a proper authorization model, because there are many different security principles in Azure, but also per Azure resource, it can differ how you need to authorize your users or your support teams. Costs are very important, especially with new components like Purview or Synapse or Data Factory, and you move a lot of data. Costs can be substantially. You can, for example, with a very big Spark cluster in Synapse, you can create a cost bill of 10,000 euros in a couple of days easily. So be aware of the cost, but make sure that you monitor the cost and preferably alert on the costs. So if someone has an anomaly in the cost curve, then create an alert, and you can do that by using budgets and cost alerts in Azure. Security and compliance monitoring. Use the tooling that's available in Azure. It's pretty good. It's advanced. For example, the SIEM tooling, Sentinel, it has an AI engine underneath. So there's a lot of detection, security threat detection in that tool. And there's a lot of functionality in the tool to do hunting and remediation of your security incidents. But also Azure monitoring, Azure Monitor is very advanced. So there's a lot of, and like I showed, the regulatory and compliance in Microsoft Defender for Cloud. There's a lot of useful tooling in Azure. Decentralization is key. Otherwise, you'll lose scalability in the long run. So make sure that you decentralize your landing zones and put all the specific functionality that's needed in that landing zone, keep that together, because otherwise you will end up with a very complex authorization model, and it's hard to set policies on that specific landing zone if they are not applicable to all landing zones. So you will have also a lot of integration challenges. So decentralization is really key, with an exception, of course, of the identity and access management, connectivity, and the management subscriptions. These are mostly centralized, but the landing zones, so the workload landing zones, I would really decentralize them. And last but not least, I have a couple of references. The Cloud Adoption Framework, all the documentation is on the Microsoft site. The Cloud Scale Analytics scenario, which I just showed, is also fully described on the Microsoft site. And there was a SoConnect data meetup I referenced earlier, but I think it's society internal only. Because I don't know if that has been published on YouTube yet, but I will check that with the organizer. So yeah, this was my presentation. So I want to thank you for joining, and if you have any questions, please be my guest.
Yeah, Erik, thank you very much for this this lecture. Thank you very much. Just looking at the chat, there are no new questions there. So perhaps if there's a question afterwards, you can always send it to my email address or to Erik Kuipers. There's no problem there. Yep. So just want to thank you again for this lecture, Erik. Well done. I will dismiss the recording. On that. So I all wish you a very nice evening. Have a great dinner, and see you for the next time, the next meetup. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.